Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. This video, I'll be reviewing the DM's Guild Rules Supplement Challenge Accepted by Justin Handlin, aka Crit Academy, a Dungeons & Dragons podcast for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider supporting me via patreon.com using my affiliate links for your DM's Guild shopping. Shout out to my platinum patrons, Andrew, Richard, Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Nick, and Rodney. And gold patrons, RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy and Yuma, Marcos David, Vicente, Gilberto, Sean A.K., Cert2B, Adam, Dead Lizard Lounge, and Sam. Thank you all very much for your support. I am not familiar with the Crit Academy podcast. My apologies, Justin. I did subscribe to it as of now because it sounds like that is very much my jam. But as of the moment of this review, I do not have any experience with the podcast. I also have zero experience with Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition. My history, very briefly, is I did play some 2nd edition back in high school, dabbled with it, the actual pen and paper. And then I have experience with 3rd and 3.5 edition through Neverwinter Nights, through years of playing Neverwinter Nights, never tabletop, but video game wise. And then obviously I have a lot of experience with 5th edition, having now played D&D, of course, as part of our YouTube stream and all that for several years now. But I never did play 4th edition. I was not into D&D at that time, and there were like no video games for 4th edition's era either. It was very short-lived. Obviously, it led to the whole Pathfinder thing, and I'm not going to go into all that history. I preface all this because Challenge Accepted takes a apparently well-received rule from 4th edition D&D and applies it to 5th edition, which in this case it is skill challenges, which are, from what I can tell, turning encounters into multiple stages of skill checks. And they can be any kind of encounter. It can be not a combat encounter, obviously, although you can have skill encounters during combat, which gets a little confusing. But it's like you have to, investigate something or search for something, or maybe you have to navigate, your boat down a river, or doing something that you want to have be more than just one person making one skill check. You want it to really involve the entire party making multiple skill checks, and not of the same skill. You can have them making different skill checks. So for the going down the river, it's somebody having a perception check to look ahead. It's somebody rolling, a nature check to try to determine, okay, what's the water going to do here? It's making a strength check to try and actually row the boat. Having all of these different things allows different characters to utilize what they're best with, and also allows all the players at the table to get involved in a situation that might not necessarily have combat involved. I think it's a really cool idea. It definitely gamifies D&D to where I understand maybe that's why 5th edition got more away from that. And I think as written in the book, in the player's handbook, we do have group checks, which I think is the only facsimile for D&D 5th edition, which from what I recall is the entire group makes a single skill check with a single DC of the same thing. So every player rolls, for example, let's say the entire party needs to sneak past a slumbering dragon or something. You would have every single person make a stealth check as a group roll, and then as long as half of them make a succeed on whatever DC the DM picked, then it is considered a successful group check. I think that's the only thing 5th edition has. Whereas with 4th edition, it would be, and what's presented here in Challenge Accepted is that would be a multi-stage process of like, okay, you're going to use stealth to sneak ahead. You're going to use investigation to determine how, drowsy this dragon is. You're going to use perception for the best area to be able to sneak over here, maybe. So it creates different avenues for the party to be able to ideally work together and be able to utilize what they're all best at, which I think is pretty cool. So I'm really down for that. I think it's interesting, and it makes me wonder. It's a bummer why, if this was such a big thing in 4th edition, again, I have no experience with it, why that didn't quite make the transition to 5th edition, other than it can, I guess, have the potential to get pretty complicated. And this one does in some ways get a little bit gamey in terms of, if you roll this check, then you might have advantage on the next check doing this one, and this one will give you this consequence. It does require an extra level of bookkeeping for DMs, and it requires the DM to keep up and really to have all this planned beforehand, because this is part of the key here is that you really need to have this all prepped ahead of time, or at least most of it ahead of time. Like, this situation the players are going to be in is going to be a skill encounter, and then you need to kind of plan out, okay, here are the different skills that I think my players are going to use to surpass this encounter, and here are the different consequences involved, and here's like a total success, partial success, and a failure. So it requires a lot more planning on the DM's part, and of course, as DMs, we can't ever plan for everything. So there's going to be the potential for a player wanting to use a skill that is one that you did not even think of, or a tactic that you haven't thought of at all. Everybody has at least one player that will do that to you, at least once a session. Bless that player for making things interesting, but also for keeping us on our toes, because you can't really plan for that. So it can be challenging in that way. I know I'm going off on a tangent, but it's really interesting the way this has presented me with a rule system that I hadn't really thought, I hadn't really leaned into pretty hard before. Again, because I have no experience with fourth edition and skill challenges before. Now, you might be asking, justifiably so, well, Eric, why do I need to purchase this product if it's just telling me this fairly simple rule system? And the rule system is just this. Like, it's basically covered in a single page here, which is you divide up an encounter into whatever different skills that you think are going to be used. And then with each skill, as part of that DM prep I talked about, with each skill has its own DC. So, for example, for that sneaking past a slumbering dragon thing, the stealth check might be considered a hard DC, which means it's a DC of 20. Whereas if you want to you could use perception to try and see where the best spot to sneak would be, and that might be an easier roll. So maybe that would be a moderate or even an easy, depending on, I don't know, whatever you think is the DM to make it. And then that might have the extra benefit of, for example, maybe you only allow your players to make that perception roll once, and then that could grant advantage on at least the next stealth roll that somebody else makes. So there's some interesting, things you can put on there, but you have to have all of that prepped out, or at least most of it. And that's all it is. It's just making a bunch of those, and then however many they have to have is determined by the complexity. So as a DM, you have to determine how complex is this encounter from a 1 to a 3. There's not really a guideline here given in terms of, like, what are some examples of complexity 1 and complexity 2, other than the fact that this book is, the majority is examples, but I didn't see a guideline in terms of, like, a complexity 1 means this, complexity 2 means that. So again, it's just kind of up to the DM to determine how complex is the situation. All that determines is how many successes, because again, you're doing multiple skill checks. How many successes does it take to succeed on this challenge? You fail if you roll 3 failures, no matter what. So as soon as you reach 3, it's a hard fail, and your team has completely failed whatever they set out to do. So that leaves us with 3 possible conclusions to an encounter. One of them is a total success, which means we succeeded on all our checks and we never made a failure. We never failed a single skill check roll. The other one is a partial success, or this one just calls it success. I wish it was worded slightly differently, because it makes it confusing having total success, and failure, in my opinion. Success, or what I like to think of as a partial success, means that you did succeed in what you were looking to do, but some of you failed in your tasks, which means it adds some complication. So, for example, maybe you made it past the sleeping dragon, but maybe it woke up after you snuck past it, and now it's on high alert. Or maybe some other creature is now alert to what you're doing. Or maybe, somebody fell and tripped and broke their leg or something. I don't know, but some kind of complication arose even though you succeeded. And then obviously a failure, that dragon's waking up and you're in trouble. So you have failed the challenge. So, and the complexity determines how many successes. So if it's an easy complexity 1, or not very complex, you only need 4 successes, versus the most complex situation, you need 8 successes. That's a lot of skill check rolls too. I would be very wary about, unless it's a really big climactic moment that's going to involve everybody doing something interesting, I would be very about having your characters just make the same things, especially if it's a case of, like, where somebody's like, well, I'll just do this thing that this player's doing. You really want your players to be able to do unique things and have that feeling of, and not every situation can be like this, where players are on a starship and everybody's got their own things they can be doing. Not every encounter is going to allow for that, but if you got a really complex situation, I think you need to have a ton of different options for your players to be able to employ. Otherwise, I think having everybody roll, once or twice maximum, which would be again a 4 or 5 or 6, and that doesn't include failures too. I mean, that would be more if they failed, would be more appropriate. So again, you might be asking, well, why do we need an entire DM's Guild product if that's all the information we need, which is basically explained in this one page, although it is pretty well detailed amongst about 5 or 6 pages here. And if you already know the rules in 4th edition, then you could probably already apply that to 5th edition without, much complexity with the transferring of the rules. The answer to that is that this product includes 16 skill challenge encounter examples. That is the majority of what this product is, because the rules take up, as you can see here, about, let's say we begin on page 5 and it ends on page 8. Technically spills over to page 9. So we've got 3 or 4 pages of actual rules explaining what skill challenges are, which is very useful for someone like me who has no idea what skill challenges are. I think it does a great job explaining that, and explains why they're useful, as I mentioned, because you can involve more players. You get more people involved in doing the thing, and it makes it more dynamic and interesting for everybody. And it introduces the fact that you can fail, but that's never a game over. At least it really should never be a game over. It can always lead to just different situations. Always allow your players an out, for example, if they do fail completely, unless they have made terrible decisions and you want to kill them, then by all means do that. But I do like the concept of multiple consequences and not necessarily just a win or fail condition. So I appreciate that a lot. Another thing I appreciate with the rules here, before I move on to the encounter examples, is hit dice are used as a consequence, which I think is really interesting, and I haven't ever thought of using before. Obviously, we have exhaustion in 5th edition, which is very useful, although it's also one of those things that can be a little hard to keep up with. Hit dice is a lot easier to keep up with because it's just ticking down a number, and that also reflects a form of exhausting your characters without literally giving them exhaustion levels. And I like that because for a lot of situations, you don't want to necessarily just do damage to your players, especially if it's outside of combat and you're just doing something, then it's not terribly difficult for them to just heal up afterwards. But if you take away hit dice, that is an interesting appeal of lowering their ability to heal, especially if they're somewhere that's in a fairly dangerous situation, then you can tick away that hit dice. And that can feel just more painful than maybe current hit points as well. So I like that concept a lot. It's just taking away hit dice as a consequence for failure, which is used as some of these skill checks, is really interesting. And the fact that they're used not as failing the entire encounter, but sometimes as failing a skill check. So, for example, if it's something like you are like the rowing the boat down the river, maybe you're doing a strength check, it might have the added consequence of, if you fail that strength check, you also lose a hit dice because you are exerting yourself in doing that activity. So that's just an interesting way it's used. So the skill challenges, there are 16 included here, and this is the majority of what this DM's Guild product is. It's all of these different example encounters. You might be thinking, why do we need these? Just give me the rules and we're done. And I might agree with you, except I'm here to tell you in this review that these encounters are extremely excellent. They do a good job of offering a wide variety of encounters that you could use skill challenges in. For example, there's a lot of environmental encounters. So, for example, trying to survive in a blizzard, or trying to survive in a river rapids situation with a boat. Or they might be urban stuff. So having a chase sequence, you're chasing after a thief or an assassin, or you're investigating a murder that just recently happened. Or maybe stuff that is involved in dungeons. So, for example, a flooding chamber, there's water coming in because of a trap that's set off. There's a bunch of zombies there. So some players have to fight the zombies, and others have to make these skill checks in order to bypass that. Same thing with the where's the demon one? The Rift to the Abyss, which is shown on the cover. Really cool art here. where there's a bunch of demons pouring through portals, and some of the players have to fight the demons, and others have to essentially make Arcana checks or history or investigation or whatever else to slow the demons down. Just a lot of really cool ideas here that not only provide interesting encounter ideas, but more importantly, obviously, provide excellent examples of how our skill challenges actually used, and giving just a wide variety and in terms of different models. So some of them might grant advantages on others, some of them might have their own failures, some of them can only be used once, and obviously there are different degrees of success. Total success, success, and failure. And a really good example is this Rift to the Abyss, which again takes place during maybe in the middle of a dungeon or something, and it is a unique situation. And again, not all of these are designed for combat. And when I initially read this, I thought, okay, these are encounters that are specifically not combat related, because obviously we have a lot of tools of how to do combat. So this is for outside of combat stuff, when there's a complex trap, or you're navigating some kind of hazardous terrain or something like that. We're doing some kind of overland travel, or we're negotiating with somebody. For example, you need to talk to an NPC. That's another example genre category I missed. You're just doing social checks. I thought that all of those are separate from combat, but that's not actually the case. You can use skill challenges in combat. I have never, I don't think, done something like this before, where you literally can divide the players up. Obviously, it's the player's choice on who wants to just hit things and who wants to make skill checks. And I don't know, I would be really interested to hear. First of all, I want to be interested for everybody to make comments on the video on your experience with skill challenges in 4th edition, or if you've used them in 5th edition. But I'd be very interested to see how that operates with combat, because I have mixed feelings about putting some characters out of combat in order to use skill checks. But I kind of get the appeal on that. That makes a very video gamey thing of there's one character maybe trying to shut a portal down. It was obviously that's what this one is. While others are trying to hold back the tide. That has a really cool appeal for me and a very memorable moment. Would that equate to being memorable if one character is literally just making a skill check versus everybody else being able to do all the different combat stuff? I don't know. I don't have much experience with that, but I like the idea behind it. It's not something I would employ very often, but I think it's really interesting, especially because you could have multiple people making the skill checks, as is the case here. And this is the Rift to the Abyss is another good example of the fact that different skill checks will have different difficulty, different DC values listed for each one. And it's just up to the DM to try to prep that stuff and figure it out, because this stuff's going to be very hard to do on the fly. But so, for example, the Arcana check, which is how to actually, close the portals magically, is a hard DC. That's a DC of 20. That's pretty damn hard to get. And if the character fails, they lose a hit die. So it's pretty damn tricky to do it via Arcana. However, a player could attempt an investigation check, which would allow them to better, study the runes, study the rituals, and all the magical effects that are going on. And as you can see, it's listed here that if they succeed, not only does that count as a success, but that also grants advantage on the next Arcana check. Now, my question here would be a little bit of a balance issue: is why don't just everybody roll an investigation check? There needs to be a little bit better, firmer rules, I feel like, about it's. I already feel like there's a lot of rules here, but it's a shame to ask for more. But I do think more of these needed to be listed, the fact that they can only be used once. And the idea to me is that outside of combat, at least, every character should be doing a different thing before somebody gets to do multiple things. So I would literally treat all these skill challenges as almost their own turn-based encounter, and have every player say, okay, this person's going to do this. What are you going to do? And then what are you going to do? And what are you going to do? And everybody can come up with their own things that they're going to do. That's going to equate to a different skill, and that's going to equate to a different DC that they have to hit. And they all have a chance to get successes or failures. That's how I would run it. These don't necessarily spill all that out, but and some of them do state you can only use this once, but a lot of them are a little more vague about that. But I like that concept. So you can even split players up between combat and non-combat. I don't know how well that would work. I like the appeal behind it. That's something I would need to see in action to see how well it would go over, in terms of some players get to do all the combat stuff and others are just rolling a check. But it's the people that are rolling the skill checks that are really going to complete the encounter. So that might add another interesting variant to that. So that might be an interesting way of looking at it. But in this case, total success, which again means, and it's complexity 1, I should have mentioned that. So you need 4 successes before before there are 3 collective failures. You need 4 collective successes. Total success, which means there were no failures, means the rift collapse. You shut down the demon portal's opening, and any demons that are within 10 feet of the portal is sucked back into it if they fail a strength saving throw. So it's just awesome, awesome, awesome for you. Partial success, which means there were some failures rolled, but not enough to fail the whole thing, means that the rift collapses, which is good, but it explodes, which means a fireball is set off and damages everybody in there. So that's a great example of the thing you wanted to happen does happen, but there are some consequences. And then total failure means, unfortunately, the portal doesn't close, demons come pouring out, and now you're really up shit creek as a DM because your players need to get the hell out of there and come up with some other tool. So that one gets a little bit dicey, but I like the way these encounters are drawn out. They're very well detailed. They, again, cover the gamut of every kind of different situation. I really like the murder investigation, which is a great example of having different players utilize different skills. So, for example, you can investigate the body. You can use a medicine check on the wound. You can use perception to see all nearby clues. You could use nature in case there are any, like, any poisons being used. You can use persuasion to persuasion or intimidation or insight to, question witnesses, for example. You can use history to try to remember things about the character's clothes and what the situation would be. Like, these are just great ideas. It just works really well in involving the whole party rather than dumping an entire bit of information and thing into a single skill check. So I do think that's very interesting, with the caveat that a DM has to do a hell of a lot more prep work in setting all this up, which is a little intimidating. And it's something to where I definitely wouldn't use a whole lot of these, just for that reason, that it does feel like it's a lot of work to be able to set all of this stuff up. But if I knew there was going to be a marquee situation that was going to be a big deal that I knew my players were going to run into, I could definitely see, like, especially if you're like investigating somebody or just doing some kind of encounter, I could definitely see using turning that encounter into a skill challenge once all the work has been done. Really good presentation also and layout. Artwork is pretty solid throughout, just really well organized. At the very end, there's a little bit of a bonus addition here where we get a list of basically hazardous terrain and complex traps. They're not terribly impressive. There's only 3 of these complex traps listed, and they're pretty standard. It's got like the spikes from the floor, the statues that you pass through that spew like a breath of, I think they're cold air in this one, white dragon breath torrent. Nothing terribly impressive, but the point of this one isn't necessarily to provide crazy cool traps. That wasn't the name of the DM's Guild product. It was to provide some complexity into a skill encounter. And in this case, it was to add this. So, for example, if they have to open a sealed door and this trap is placed in the room, that can add some additional complications to a skill challenge. And the trap itself might not be the most interesting, but it does provide different things that the players could use. For example, wisdom, perception, investigation, as well as different countermeasures that players could try to employ to disable it. So that would be, it's basically trying to build up to a skill encounter, which could have probably just been done as a skill encounter, but it is kind of nice to see this here. I just consider these a bonus. So I was going to list these as a con because I wasn't really very impressed with these traps, but I don't think this takes away from the actual encounter system that's laid out here with the skill challenges. And I like the added details of all the different countermeasures. It also just goes to show that even developing something like a trap is that much work is put into it on the DM's point of view if you want to turn these into a skill encounter, because you really have to think ahead, or I guess be really, really good at thinking on your feet in terms of coming up with the numbers and the complexity level and all these different things, the DC numbers, all of that to come up with a proper skill challenge. But I am pretty positive on this, even though it's a little gamey and a little rules heavy. The rules aren't complicated. It just adds a lot more work on the DM's point of view, in my opinion, to get this done. So it's not something I would employ terribly often, but it is something I'm very interested in adding to my own D&D games, and that is, frankly, I think, pretty high praise. So let's go over my pros and cons for Challenge accepted. Pro, excellent layout and presentation. Obviously, no complaints from me. I think it looks great. It's good artwork throughout. Well organized. No complaints. Pro, 16 well constructed encounters that utilize skill challenges. That is the bulk of what this book is. Normally, if a rules book is like the rules are like 3 pages long and then it has like 20 pages of examples, that's pretty bizarre. But in this case, I think it works really, really well. The rules are pretty simple, which is good. And then it just lists a bunch of really interesting, well thought out encounters that is frankly the best way to teach people how skill challenges work. Instead of just looking at the hypotheticals and reading the rules, actually give me firm examples across multitudes of different genres and situations. That not only is that a great tool for teaching me about skill challenges, but it's just a fun read to see, okay, what are some situations where I could employ skill challenges? And Pro, I love that there are multiple degrees of the results at the end in terms of the total success, the success, and the failures, and that each of those has different consequences and results based on that. So I think that is in keeping with D&D in terms of even if you fail outright, it just kind of leads to a different story instead of just being a game over encounter. Cons, I basically don't have any. And that happens occasionally, but I don't really have any complaints here. Like I think it does, it sets out to add to basically just highlight this skill challenges feature from 4th edition into 5th edition. I think it does it really well. I think it looks balanced on paper, and I like all the example encounters. I wasn't big on the traps. But I did enjoy the fact that they all have their own, consequences and countermeasures, and just a lot of details about them specifically. So, yeah, I have no real complaints for this product. So, final verdict: challenge accepted. Expertly ushers skill challenges into 5th edition with over a dozen detailed example encounters. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. And you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.